Welcome back, everybody. Time for us to go behind the headlines. And on today's Behind the Headlines, we're going to take a look at whether or not you can become addicted to marijuana. And this was brought to my mind by Orlando's attorney, John Morgan, who got busted by PolitiFact recently. He was being interviewed about his drive to get medical marijuana in the ballot in Florida and was asked whether or not you could become addicted to it. And he said, quote, "Nobody's addicted to it," end quote. Now, that watchdog organization, PolitiFact, got involved when he said that, and they judged his claim as false. But Morgan himself fessed up, saying, quote, "It was a huge mistake. I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed. I messed it up," end quote. As Morgan tried to explain, he meant to compare the relatively low dependency and withdrawal that you face with cannabis to the potentially fatal risks of addictions to opioid painkillers. Now, as it turns out, marijuana is addictive, but it really depends on what you mean by addictive. My dad was a speed and alcohol addict. He wrecked at least 2 cars in DUIs. Now, there were no other cars involved. He just rolled the cars themselves. And he would often disappear on fortnight-long drinking binges when I was a kid. I watched him kick both those drugs cold turkey style once. The screams, hallucinations, vomiting, shaking, cold sweats, and nightmares he suffered through gave me a pretty clear picture of what addiction really means. I don't ever recall a marijuana dry spell that put me through the ringer like that. But just because pot ain't heroin, cocaine, meth, alcohol, or cigarettes doesn't mean it isn't addictive. According to the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, about 9%, or 1 in 11 users, will develop a clinical dependence on cannabis. That figure, by the way, is roughly the risk of dependence faced by users of benzodiazepines, like Valium, Xanax, and Ambien, as well as caffeine. Of course, the risk is greater with other drugs. Alcohol and cocaine hook about 1 in 6, heroin, meth get about 1 in 5, and cigarettes addict just about 1/3 of all the people who ever try them. The latest psychiatric manual, the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, commonly known as DSM-V, takes steps to differentiate between addiction and dependence. Charles O'Brien, MD, chair of the work group on the subject for the American Psychiatric Association, co-authored an editorial that explained, quote, "The term dependence has traditionally been used to describe physical dependence, which refers to the adaptations that result in withdrawal. However, that is distinct from addiction, which refers to the loss of control over the intense urges to take a drug, even at the expense of adverse consequences," end quote. So, now both dependence and addiction are going to be rated along a spectrum that they're going to call substance abuse disorders, broken down by type of substance. The criteria now includes drug craving, but will no longer include problems with law enforcement, since the illegality of drugs sort of creates that problem in the first place. Addiction also includes non-drug activities like gambling addiction, and noted drug researcher and author Stanton Peele, PhD, argues that someday the APA should include internet addiction, sex addiction, and food addiction to that official category. Now, the APA's definition of cannabis use disorder includes someone who ceases heavy, prolonged cannabis use and experiences, quote, "clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning," end quote. So to qualify, one must demonstrate at least 3 of the following symptoms of cannabis withdrawal: irritability, anger, or aggression, nervousness or anxiety, sleep difficulties or insomnia, decreased appetite or weight loss, restlessness, depressed mood, and or physical symptoms such as stomach pain, shakiness, or tremors, sweating, fever, chills, and headache. Well, considering how many people use cannabis to treat some of those conditions, how much of this so-called cannabis withdrawal is really just a return of the symptoms the person was treating successfully with cannabis? If cannabis were completely legal, how much pressure would a toker feel to consider himself addicted if he was allowed to go about his life and career without testing and sanctions for cannabis use? If you're using cannabis and you want to stop, but you find you're unable to, then you're dependent on cannabis. Fortunately, the Affordable Care Act has opened up many more affordable treatment options for people with substance use disorders to get professional help. But for most of us using cannabis, it enhances and enriches our lives. It is only the prohibition of cannabis that tries to force us to stop and defines us as addicts if we choose not to. If we can smoke a joint and still be responsible and productive citizens, we are no more addicted than the average buzz